Okay na.
Okay, sir. Thank you po.
So, okay, Andre, we can see your screen.
Yeah.
Okay, good day, everyone. Our report today, we will be presenting to you the online sexual exploitation of children in the Philippines, presented by Aureliano A, Caspe, AJ, Chavez, Mayan, and Valencia Andre. Thank you. First reporter, you may now start.
Next slide po. Online sexual exploitation of children, or OSEC, is a complex hidden crime that is particularly challenging for the global community. To measure and address the lack of global OSCE data, the inconsistency in data collection, sharing and analysis across agencies, and the complicity of internet-facilitated crimes has made it almost impossible to accurately study and understand this crime. Accurate information about its nature and scale is critical for informing and measuring the impact of stakeholder intervention to protect vulnerable children from ongoing exploitation and more effectively prevent this crime. Next slide, please. The purpose of this study of OSEC is defined as production for the purpose of online publication or transmission of visual depictions. For example of this is photos, videos, and live streaming of the sexual abuse or exploitation of minor for a third party who is not in the physical presence of victim in exchange for compensation. Next slide, please. According to UNICEF and Child Rights Network reported that a number of factors in the Philippines allow for easy proliferation of online sexual exploitation of children, or OSEC. This includes widespread poverty and resorting to OSC as a form of income. Second is cheap internet and smartphones. The third is ability to speak English well. And the fourth is wide availability of money remittance center and prevailing norms from secrecy. The second to the last is lack of parental supervision, sometimes caused by parents having to work abroad. And the last is the lack of resources to investigate and prosecute perpetrators, to rescue and rehabilitate victims. Next slide, please. Ang online sexual exploitation of children, or OSEC, ay tumutukoy sa pagbabahagi o pagkakalat ng mga malalaswang larawan ng video ng mga bata sa internet at pananamantala ng mga kamusmusan ng mga ito. According to DOJ, or also known as Department of Justice, noong 2018, nakatanggap sila ng halos 600,000 ng mga tips na may kasamang mga larawan at videos ng mga sexualized at inaabusong mga bata. Lubos itong nakakaalarma dahil higit na mataas ito halos sa 1,300% kumpara sa bilang na naitala noong 2017. Next slide, please. A dangerous side to the internet. Access to the internet has brought increased opportunity to children across the globe. The internet provides access to information and ideas learning, and the global marketplace, and connection to friends and families who live far away. But in addition to its benefits, this connection is also being used by criminals to exploit vulnerable children around the world. Um, Child sex offenders who would prey on victims through in person. Contact abuse can now abuse children anywhere using World Wide Web. And technology has created a marketplace where this abuse can now be bought and sold online. Next slide, please. Next slide, please po.
Next is for the key findings. So, reports of OSNIC and other forms of inter-based CSE are increasing in the Philippines. The last decade has seen a dramatic increase in reporting of suspects CSEM sharing and OSEC in the Philippines, as evidenced by the following. First, there were fewer than 50 Philippine IP addresses reported in NCMEC through cyber tipline reports in 2010 and 2011. But between 2012, when there was an initial spike in reporting, and 2017, there's been greater than 700% growth in the number of Philippine IP addresses reported to NCMEC through cyber tipline reports. Prior to 2013, fewer than 3 OSEC cases per year had been referred to and or investigated by PNP WCPC and NBI ATRAD, but from 2013 to 2017, the number of OSEC cases reported to these law enforcement agencies increased an average of 58% every year. There's been a true rise in the number of IP addresses used for CSE in the Philippines. In 2014, an estimate of 23,333 IP addresses were used for CSE, which grew to 81,723 by 2017. This represents 250% increase growth in the prevalence of IP addresses used for CSE over a 4-year time period. However, mark recapture methodology is inherently affected by the number of captures or reports of internet-based CSE. When NCMEC reporting is very low, this methodology will tend to underestimate the size of the population, and as reporting increases, the methodology will lead to higher, more accurate estimate. What caused this increase? Increase in recognition of OSEC as a crime, which has led to greater reporting to both NCMEC and law enforcement in general. The growth in cases referred to PNP WCPC and NBI ATRAD has been supported by improved relations between Philippine law enforcement and international law enforcement agencies, and increased confidence that Philippine law enforcement will responsibly investigate referrals. The rise in reporting may be due to an actual increase in the number of offenders committing the crime. IJM investigative experts in the Philippines have witnessed and can confirm that the first two factors have impacted reporting over the past 4 years. However, whether the rise in reporting is related to an actual increase in offending is harder to determine. The true prevalence of OSEC remains unknown. Many ESPs have their own template for reporting cyber tipline reports, and each ESP's template is different. This reduces the quality and completeness of NCMEC cyber tipline data and renders a massive data set with high potential for informing the field less useful from a research perspective. Criminal analysts did not identify a single incident of live streaming OSEC in the cyber tipline reports. despite the fact that Philippine law enforcement case data show that live streaming abuse is common in OSEC cases. It is suggested that the live streaming aspect of OSEC is not observed in NCMEC cyber tipline reports because ESPs do not yet have the algorithm to automatically scan video images as they can steal images. Next, the type of OSEC traffickers are unique. Majority of OSEC cases, 85% of them, involved at least one female trafficker, usually a mother or other female relative. This typology is quite unique in crimes involving sexual abuse or exploitation of children. Cases of child abuse, child sexual assault commonly involve perpetrators who are family members, but they are typically males. OSEC traffickers often rationalize their crimes by saying that they are not causing real harm to their child because the abuse primarily happens online. However, more research is needed to understand how and why OSEC traffickers begin committing these crimes. And 54% of the cases involve more than one trafficker. In multi-trafficker cases, traffickers often have distinct roles. For example, one person may communicate with the customer while the other oversees or commits the sexual abuse or collects the money for the abuse. Next is the OSEC customers tend to be older English-speaking men from developed countries. All customers identified in this study were from developed countries. This is not surprising given the finding that in 83% of the cases, traffickers appeared to be economically motivated. Previous studies have found that the age of customers ranges from mid-20s to 60s. However, this study did not identify any customer under the age of 40 and most customers were in their 50s. First, there are a few potential reasons for this. First, it may be that OSEC is not a technologically complicated crime to commit. It often involves the use of mainstream tools and platforms that do not require a great deal of sophistication to use. Second, it may be that younger customers are more tech savvy and better at anonymizing themselves online, making them harder to catch. And third, it may be that younger men are more likely to engage in the higher risk contact abuse, whereas older men may choose to engage in online abuse under the assumption that they are less likely to get caught. While hidden in homes, OSEC occurs on the surface of the internet. Traffickers identified in this study tended to communicate and exchange CSEM or CSAM with customers in a relatively non-secure way. They used platforms like social media, email, dating website, etc., with minimal security features to identify, communicate, and exchange materials with the customers. There may be a few causes for this. First, there are more potential customers on the open web, and many would-be traffickers. And many would-be traffickers can easily find customers there. Second, traffickers may perceive that they have a low risk of being caught and convicted of OSEC. Third, traffickers may not be technologically sophisticated enough to know about online privacy or security measures they can take. However, this does not mean that OSEC only occurs in public online spaces. Incidents of OSEC occurring almost exclusively on the dark web or using high-tech anonymization tools may not have been captured by this study simply because they are less likely to get caught. For the recommendations, first, the Philippine government should continue scaling up the staffing and budget for its anti-trafficking law enforcement units until they reach authorized levels at a minimum. Between 2016 and 2019, The Philippine government increased the annual operational funding for PNP-WCPC by 246% and more than doubled the number of PNP-WCPC staff. This is an excellent start, but given the large scale of the crime and the sustained sharp rise in reporting, it is recommended that the government continue increase PNP-WCPC staffing and budget until they have reached authorized levels and provide similar scaled up resourcing to NBI AFTRAD. Second, international and Philippine law enforcement agencies should maintain and build on the improved relationships and communication practices that exist between them to better hold perpetrators accountable and decrease criminal impunity globally. By joining forces with international allies, both parties would save time and resources, and their manpower would increase with the expertise of both sides. It can help ensure that investigative referrals get to appropriate operational units. Additional support is offered and directed where it is most needed, and opportunities for successful casework outcomes are maximized. Third, international and Philippine law enforcement agencies should ensure OSEC cases are routed to one of the Philippine anti-trafficking units, PNPW-CPC and NBI AFRAD. It was recommended that OSEC be considered first and foremost as a trafficking in persons offense for two reasons. First, qualified trafficking carries a stronger possible penalty than other criminal violations. Therefore, charging OSEC traffickers with trafficking could create a stronger deterrent effect. Second, considering OSEC as a trafficking offense acknowledges the unique challenges and trauma of children who have been trafficked. Because anti-trafficking units focus on this specific crime type, they can gain more specific knowledge and experience to help them guard the dignity of trafficked children and effectively resolve their cases. Fourth, government and non-government service providers should ensure a collaborative, trauma-informed, appropriate, and holistic system of care exists to address the unique needs of OSEC survivors on an individual, family, and community level. The the team recommends that service providers gain a comprehensive understanding of the characteristics, vulnerabilities, risks, and resilience factors of children, families, and communities impacted by OSEC and their context in order to inform recommendations for a robust system of care that will address the needs of these survivors. Fifth, child protective measures and informed care. Fifth, child protective measures and trauma-informed care should be implemented throughout the prosecution process of OSEC cases to protect victims from re-traumatization. Prosecutors and other justice system officials should ensure that child protective measures are employed throughout the justice system process as much as possible. These measures include reducing the resilience of victim testimonies in court, use a child-sensitive video interviewing, and, consideration of plea agreement to achieve convictions with reduced trauma to survivors. Sixth, technology platforms should identify and implement means for proactive detection of live streaming OSEC. The technology sectors, especially major tech platforms, should recognize the threat that undetected live streaming exploitation presents to vulnerable children and choose to develop and deploy new technologies, including computer vision and machine learning application of artificial intelligence to detect newly produced CSEM in all its forms, including in live video stream. Seventh, entities from across sectors should collaborate to to strengthen processes to identify and report potential OSEC activities. Additional indicator of CSEM can be found on platforms across sectors, ranging from social media platforms to cloud storage services to money agencies. Take alone, any one such indicator would be insufficient to even raise suspicion, much less confirmation, of live streaming OSEC offending. However, it is reasonable to perceive an individual's likelihood of offending to be much greater when multiple indicators involving the same user are present and recognized, even across platform or datasets. This type of cross-sector collaboration can both protect ESP system and against terms of services violation and criminal misuse and can serve to strengthen identification and reporting of suspected live streaming OSEC. 8. Reporting of suspected CSEM on ESP platforms should be expanded and strengthened through mandatory reporting legislation in all states and the provision of higher quality information in reports. ESPs should internalize responsibility in ensuring protection of children on their platforms and reporting any available associated information as allowed by law rather than the minimum amount required by law. By providing more complete information, ESPs can help remove obstacles to effectively identifying offenders and victims. Furthermore, higher quality data will allow ESPs, law enforcement, and others to better identify and respond to concerning issues and trends. Ninth, OSEC-related data owners, academics, technology designers, and OSEC experts should collaborate to conduct more research, increase our global knowledge about OSEC, as well as build the global stakeholder community's capacity to measure prevalence of the crime and impact the key intervention. Working together, they may be able to define a money transfer profile of OSEC customers and traffickers that could both help law enforcement officers identify offenders faster and help researchers better understand the offending patterns of perpetrators. 10. All stakeholders should contribute toward the increase in international and cross-sector collaboration to protect children from online exploitation. Impacted or engaged stakeholders should increase their collaboration with others on this issue, sharing learnings, data, and best practices to improve the global community's ability to protect children online. In conclusion, internet-based CSE in general and OSEC specifically appear to be rapidly growing crimes in the Philippines. The monthly number of IP addresses used for CSE increased nearly tenfold between 2014 and 2017. OSEC victims tended to be very young children of both sexes, and OSEC traffickers tend to be female relatives of the victims. The crimes occur on the surface of the internet, on commonly used platforms meant for illicit communications.
So what are the requisites to be charged for the crime of sexual exploitation of children in the Philippines? So next slide po. Republic Act 7610, Article 3, Section 5, or child prostitution and other sexual abuse. Children, whether male or female, who for money, profit, or any other consideration, or due to the coercion of influence of any adult, syndicate, or group indulge in sexual intercourse or lascivious conduct are deemed to be children exploited in prostitution and other sexual abuse. The penalty of reclusion temporal in its medium period to reclusion perpetua shall be imposed if those who engage in or promote, facilitate, or induce child prostitution, which which include but are not limited to acting as a procurer of a child prostitute, inducing a person to be a client of a child prostitute by means of written or oral advertisements or other similar means, taking advantage of influence or relationship to procure a child as a prostitute, threatening or using violence towards a child to engage him as a prostitute, or giving monetary consideration, goods, or other pecuniary benefit to a child with intent to engage such in child prostitution. Next slide po. Republic Act 7610, Article 3, Section 6, are the attempt to commit child prostitution. There is an attempt to commit child prostitution under Section 5, Paragraph A, when in any person who, not being a relative of a child, is found alone with the said child inside the room or cubicle of a house, inn, hotel, motel, pension house, apartel, or other similar establishments, vessel, vehicle, or any other hidden or secluded area under circumstances which would lead a reasonable person to believe that the child is about to be exploited in prostitution and other sexual abuse. Sa paragraph B naman po, when any person is receiving services from a child sa mga SONA, massage clinic, health club, or other similar establishment, is also an attempt to commit child prostitution. A penalty lower by 2 degrees than that prescribed for the consummated felony under Section 5 shall be imposed upon the principals of the attempt to commit the crime of child prostitution under this Act, in the proper case under the revised penal code. Next slide po. Section 9 are the obscene publication and indecent shows. Any person who shall hire, employ, use, persuade, induce, or coerce a child to perform in obscene exhibitions and indecent shows, whether live or in video, or model in obscene publication or pornographic materials, or to sell or distribute the said materials, shall suffer the penalty of prison mayor in its medium period. The penalty po shall be imposed in its maximum period if the child used as a performer, subject, or seller or distributor is 12 years of age, is below 12 years of age. Next slide po. Section 10, other acts of neglect, abuse, cruelty, or exploitation and other conditions prejudicial to the child's development. Next slide po. Doon po tayo mag-focus sa letter E. Any person who shall use, coerce, force, or intimidate a street child or any child to beg or use begging as a means of living, mamalimos po, act as a conduit or middleman in drug trafficking or pushing, yung siya po ang namamagitan between the seller and the buyer. And number 3, conduct any illegal activities shall suffer the penalty of prison correctional in its medium period to reclusion perpetua.
Next, let's talk about pandemic worsens online child sexual abuse in Philippines, says a global report. So what I'm going to tell you today is about Ruby's story. So Ruby is not really the name of the child, but rather this has been changed to protect the victim. So in front of a computer camera, this Ruby was forced to perform for viewers as her sexual exploitation was streamed live. So according to her, it was like being trapped in a dark room without any rays of light at all. There was no point in according to her, there was no point in living at all. You do disgusting shows every day, every time, and then after doing that, you go to sleep and repeat the same routine every single day. And it's like there's no ending at all. So Ruby's sexual abuse started when she received a message on social media from someone who offered her a job at a computer shop with a reasonable salary. So meron daw tong free boarding and lodging, yung usual package kapag ino-offeran kayo ng trabaho in-house. Plus meron daw reimbursement para sa pamasahe. But then, nalaman ni Ruby later on that the actual job was far different than what she had been told. She tried to escape but was threatened with a knife by the couple running the trafficking operation, who told her that she must first pay off her debts to them. So yung mga utang na nangyayari dito is yung for sure yung mga pamasaheng na ibigay na niya, yung lodging niya, etc., yung food. And acting on a tip, after malaman ng iba yung kwento ni Ruby, the International Justice Mission or the IJM Center to End Sexual Exploitation of Children was coordinated to the Philippines to rescue this Ruby. So isa lang si Ruby sa napakaraming tao na that still experience online sexual exploitation until today. So the traffickers were convicted and sentenced to jail while IJM helped Ruby in restoration of her journey. So kay Ruby lang to, kay kwento lang ni Ruby to. This is not the entire population or the entire group na natulungan natin. So now free and safe, she was thinking of pursuing a law degree to help other girls under similar circumstances. According to the We Protect Global Alliance, a global movement of people and organizations that aims to end child sexual exploitation and abuse online. Ay, yan. Abuse online. So this significant spike, especially a Ruby story, is just one of the many cases of child sexual exploitation and online abuse, although a very significant spike was observed last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic that led to kids spending more time on private messaging services behind closed doors. This means because of the pandemic and because we stay indoors more, katulad ng ibang ratings that VAUSI has increased, ganun din po sa online child exploitation. Nag-increase din po yung rates nila because children spend more time indoors and in front of computers. So based on the newly published 2021 Global Threat Assessment report by the We Protect Global Alliance, there has been a recorded of 265%. So this is almost triple the increase in online child sexual abuse between March and May of 2020. So that's just in the midst of the rise of COVID-19 pandemic. What more nung kalagitnaan na talaga. So over the past 2 years, we have observed an increase in the scale and complexity of child sexual abuse online. This report should act as a wake-up call to all of us. Together, we must step up to the global response and create a safer digital world for children. So mas kita po natin dito and mas pinoprove ng the Global Threat Assessment reveals that the live stream child sexual abuse for payment is increasing, with demand side offenders unable to travel turning to live streamed abuse. Because nga of the COVID-19 pandemic, hindi nakakaalis sa mga abusers natin to actually get these children, they turn to live streamed abuse. So this is a reminder that the greater global and national collaboration is needed to protect children through sustained whole of society approaches, including more effective and resource justice system. So that ends our presentation. Could you go back to slide 1, Andre? Ayan. So gusto lang po namin mag-thank you for listening to our presentation for today on online sexual exploitation of children in the Philippines. Thank you po.
Bigay mo sa akin yung control. Yes. Okay na?
Okay na po, sir.
Ah, si Miss Cortina. Hello?
Andito na po, Doc.
Pwede na kayo?
Yes po.
Sige, bibigay ko sa yung control ah.
Doc, pwede po kay Miss Derada po ba lagay ang control po?
Sige. Game.
Wait lang po, Doc.
Wait lang po, Doc. Hello po, good afternoon po. So, we are Blanco, Cortina, and Derada, and we will discuss about investigating sexual abuse. So, for the contents of our report, first, we will tackle about the introduction to toolkit, facts about sexual violence, coordination and cooperation, stakeholders, ethics, competencies, support and protection for victims, preparing to gather the story, documenting the story and response, and elements of initial investigation. Kasama na rin po yung minimum requirements for the health facility, managing the health issues, the forensic medical examination, papasadahan din po natin yung medical-legal evidence in sexual violence, forensic specimens, of course, yung female and male genitalia, and then itatakal din po namin yung present and future status of investigating sexual abuse, and magdi-discuss rin po kami ng case study about our report.
So for the first content of our presentation, it is the introduction to toolkit. Increased attention was given to end the impunity for perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict-affected settings and to achieve assistance and justice for victims. This is important part of the response to sexual violence. There remains a lack of clarity about what medical-legal evidence should be collected to support national and international criminal justice processes. Medical-legal evidence is at the intersection of medical and justice processes, and appropriate implementation requires coordination between the range of actors and sectors involved in the prevention of and response to sexual violence. This includes health services, social services, forensic medicine, forensic lab services, police or investigators, and the legal system, including the lawyers and judges. This toolkit is practitioner focused and addresses key knowledge gaps within and between sectors to help support service provision and coordination in low resource setting. It is a part of World Health Organization and United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime project on strengthening medical-legal services for sexual violence cases in conflict-affected settings, supported by United Nations Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict. Next page po. So here are uh, the contents in the box are the procedures on how to use this in this toolkit. So this first is this job aids are intended to provide basic and key information to a range of actors involved in medical legal care system in conflict affected low resource settings such as places where lack of access to medical care, stress, and malnutrition are evident. So the people who uses this toolkit are the health, health, social serv- health, social services, forensic, police or investigation, law sectors, and those engaged in the process of coordination between these sectors. These actors these people are the ones who's been dealing with victims of sexual assault, who is involved in the medical criminal or legal responses to sexual violence. They were the key actors since they are believed to have the most comprehensive and thorough understanding about sexual violence. Third, the primary and secondary audiences for each job aids are designated at the top of each fact sheet. Fourth, the job aids are one page each to enable quick reference to the most important information. Next is there is a limit to how much can be included on one page. The fact sheets only addresses the key considerations, and additional references or resources are provided at the end of the fact sheets. Next is relevant related job aids are noted at the top of each fact sheet. Next, it is recommended that someone working in a more central role within this system are or who is responsible for coordinating with other parts of medical legal system reads all the job aids as well as the background paper and policy note. Most likely, they have the specialized skills necessary to provide competent, effective crisis intervention services to sexual assault victims. Next is label diagrams of female and male genitalia are included in this toolkit. Using these label diagrams will provide thorough physical and genital examination. Moreover, these are intended to help all medical legal professionals, especially those without training in human anatomy, to use more precise and accurate terminologies when requesting examination and reviewing and interpreting evidence. Next is wait. Next is the establishment of health and psychosocial services for those who experience sexual violence. Is primary importance to their well-being to assess the effects of psychosocial interventions on mental and well-being for survivors of rape, sexual assault experienced during adulthood. The collection of medical legal evidence should not be done in the absence or at the expense of this service provision. Next is the term victim is used to designate those who have experienced sexual violence. This is not to intend or to imply any lack of agency or empowerment. Additionally, this word is commonly used when discussing a crime or when referencing the criminal justice system. Next is the toolkit is designed for use in resource poor settings. Although the general principles apply to all settings, even in the high resource settings, since most of the intervention are available may vary depending on the setting. Next slide. So here are the facts about the sexual violence. So the individuals that must have good understanding of the sexual violence are first any person who works with individuals who have experienced sexual violence, and the second are the medical, criminal justice, or legal systems response to sexual violence. So in these two boxes, I'm going to explain the key points of the sexual violence. First is sexual violence is any act that is perpetrated against someone's will. It can be committed by any person regardless of their relationship to the victim in any settings. It includes, but it is not limited to rape, attempted rape, and sexual slavery, as well as the unwanted touching, threatened sexual violence, and verbal sexual harassment. So here po is the definition of rape. Rape is contact between the penis and the vulva or the penis and the anus involving penetration. However, slight contact between the mouth and penis, vulva or anus, or penetration of the anal or genital opening of another person by hand, finger, or other object. The acts of sexual violence that are considered criminal offenses may differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There are specific laws vary by state, but sexual assault generally refers to any crime in which the offender subjects the victim to sexual touching that is unwanted and offensive. Some jurisdictions often have slightly different sentencing guidelines and definition about it. Next, what is in conflict-affected settings? Sexual violence can include violence perpetrated by combats, as well as the violence within the community and family or intimate partnership. The offenders of sexual violence is not limited to strangers. They can also be the people who are close around the victim or the people that others look up into. Next is anyone can be a victim of sexual violence, including children and women and men of all ages. Everyone can be a victim of sexual violence regardless of the individual's identity. There are no laws or rules stating that there are limitations regarding the individuality of the sexual victims. Next is sexual violence can occur anywhere. It can also occur any time of the day. It is only a myth that sexual violence can only occur in dark alleys and in isolated areas. In fact, majority of the sexual violence cases happens in places ordinarily thought to be safe, such as homes, cars, workplace, school, place of detention, or camps for refugees or the internally displaced. Next is the absence of physical injuries does not mean that rape did not occur. Many rape survivors are not visibly injured. Correspondingly, does not indicate that the victim consented the perpetrator. The ability of the victim to give consent must be determined in accordance with the individual's state statutes. Physical resistance is not required on the part of the victim to demonstrate the lack of consent. Next is sexual violence can have short and long-term physical, psychological, and social impacts on the victims. Example of the effects of the sexual violence are having STDs, having feelings of anxiety, stress, or fear, flashbacks or memories of the past traumas as if they were taking place in the current moment, which are not always easy to deal with, but with the right help of support, they can be managed. Next is a victim's previous or current involvement in the commercial sex work does not mean that he or she was not raped. The victim should not be discriminated just because she did or does commercial sex for work. Rape is rape as long as there is no consent and regardless of what the victim was doing at that time. Next is rape can also occur between spouses and other intimate partners. It is a type of sexual abuse for forcing or manipulating their spouses or partners into unwanted intercourse. This is a common form of violence even in a conflict-affected area. Next is most rape cases are never reported to the police. Some reasons for not reporting the abuse are fear-based, owing to shame, stigma, fear of negative repercussion, or knowledge that the response will be limited. Moreover, some are more personal or simply do not believe that there will be any benefit to reporting the abuse. Next slide po.
So next we have coordination and cooperation. The provision of medical legal services to victims of sexual crime requires the involvement of a range of system and profession, including health and social service providers, forensic medicine, forensic lab services, police, and the legal system, including lawyers and judge. Coordination is more than just holding meetings or sharing information. In fact, it also requires working together in a way that holds coherence across sectors. It is also a way to develop and enhance the functioning of services and improve outcomes for victims. Coordination requires commitment and engagement from all relevant entities, such as organization, departments, and services, and dedicated staff with sufficient time to ensure coordination and participation. A critical first step to coordination is to identify which entities need to be involved. They should be represented by individuals who are knowledgeable about their discipline and empowered to make decisions for the entities. Meetings should also include both female and male representative, and participating entities should aim for equal representation and ensure that women voices are heard. It is useful to identify an individual whose role is to facilitate the administration of coordination. It is important to clarify roles and responsibilities and processes in the intent and to also identify challenges. Entities should have a role in identifying the terms of reference of the coordination and how it will be undertaken. This is important for buy-in and partnership. Information sharing is important for coordination. What information will be shared, how often, and how emails or meetings should be decided by the group. The group should develop a clear understanding of what can and cannot be shared and why, such as medical files, which cannot be shared due to doctor and patient confidentiality. Face-to-face meetings are important for coordination. Entities should help identify how often and where meetings will be held. Meetings should be held in a location that is accessible to all. Draft agendas for meetings should be shared in advance and to give participants an opportunity to provide feedback. The written summaries of meetings, which include action points and who is responsible for them, are important for recording decisions taken and ensuring appropriate follow-up. An important component of coordination is the clarification of roles and responsibilities and the establishment of referral pathways between the different sectors and providers. Next slide, please. So next we have the key stakeholders. These key stakeholders should be included in the development and coordination of systems in order to ensure that they are responsive and effective. Government entities are key stakeholders and have the primary responsibility to participate and bring others on board. While this may be challenging in conflict-affected settings, the development of government systems should be a priority. It is important to integrate medical legal services in the existing healthcare services. First, we have the service provider, which may include international and national non-governmental organizations, such as health providers, the emergency room staff, specialist health providers, midwife, nurses, and physicians. We also have providers of psychosocial support and social services, and specialized services for children, forensic physicians, and forensic nurses. We also have forensic laboratory services, police, legal system, which may include international criminal tribunals, judges, prosecutor, investigators, legal aid providers, and human rights organizations. We also have victims or survivors group, social support groups, which may include women's group, ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, religious organization, indigenous people, and organization working with children. We also have the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex group or the LGBTQ community. Next slide, please. Next, we have the ethics. This ethics must require individuals, agencies, and organizations that are part of the medical legal process that they have to act in accordance with the following core ethical principles. First, we have the physical safety and emotional well-being of the victim, which it should be the primary consideration. The confidentiality of the victim or his or her information must also be guaranteed. There should be a legal limitation to confidentiality. This information must be shared with the victim as early as possible in order to allow him or her to make an informed decision about the disclosure. The victim's wishes and rights must also be respected. The victims must be informed of his or her option and be able to exercise autonomy to make informed choices. Individuals, agencies, and organizations must not discriminate against victims on any basis. This includes religion, race, sex, gender identity, age, ethnic group, profession, socioeconomic level, political affiliation, or sexual orientation. Those interacting with victims must be careful not to make promises and misrepresentation, particularly regarding security that cannot be guaranteed. There must be policies in place to protect those who may not be in position to legally consent to medical and medical legal processes. Next slide, please. Competencies. Professionals involved in the provision of medical legal services should have specific skills and knowledge related to their function within the system. In addition to these professional competencies, there are some core competencies that all those working with victims of sexual violence should possess. Uh, mo- Here are some core competencies. All those working in the medical legal system should know the relevant laws and policies about sexual violence in the country's jurisdiction, including what is considered a crime and who is competent to collect evidence and to testify as a professional or expert witness in cases of sexual assault. They should also know any informal or traditional justice system that may be in place, know the relevant information on gender and sexual violence, know and abide by the relevant professional ethical standards. They also have to have an appropriate level of professional training and qualification in their field. They have to understand that a victim has a right to decide who has access to his or her information and to choose the sex of the forensic examiner and other professional providing services and to choose what care he or she receives. They also have to understand and respect the choices that the victim makes, understand the importance of prioritizing the well-being and safety of the victim over anything else, including collection of medical legal evidence. They have to know the relevant principles, policies, and laws that regulate confidentiality of consultation and records, including any mandatory reporting requirements. They have to know how to interact with victims in ways that minimize further traumatization and harm. They also have to know they have to know how to communicate with victims in a non-judgmental and empathetic way. know the components of the medico-legal system and how they relate to each other, understand the importance of working in a multidisciplinary way to deliver services that minimize harm in the short term and longer term. Lastly, they have to be aware of basic facts regarding sexual violence. Next slide, please. All aspect, here we have the support and protection for victims. All aspects of the response to sexual violence should also ensure support and protection for victims. In conflict affected settings, victims may face retribution by perpetrators if they report the sexual violence, and stigmatization or rejection by their community or family if the fact that they were raped became known. A survivor-centered approach prioritize the rights, choices, and needs of the victim, which is an essential component of ensuring protection and promoting recovery and is enhanced by well-coordinated responses. The victim's autonomy in a survivor-centered approach should be respected, and he or she is provided with the information needed and the right to make decision about his or her case, including whether to report the case to the police or if there are any mandatory reporting laws. These are explained clearly to the victim so she or he can make an informed choice as to whether to proceed with the case or not. The victim's safety is considered the highest priority. The victim is not discriminated against regardless of religion, race, sex, gender identity, ethnic group, profession, socioeconomic level, political affiliation, or sexual orientation or other factors. The victim's right is confidential is the victim's right to confidentiality must be respected. Victims must be provided with accurate information about where they can receive services to address their immediate and longer term needs. This information about where the services are available should also be available to the community. Victims must be enabled to access all aspects of the medical legal system. This include ensuring that they receive support to overcome barriers, including support for transport, support for family care obligations, support through all the steps of the investigation and any subsequent police case. Lastly, there should be specific provision for care for those with specific needs, including children, men and elderly or disabled people who are victims of sexual violence. Next, please. Preparing to gather the story. The aim of this job is to provide some suggestions to prepare individuals to whom the story of sexual violence is told. It is essential to respect and maintain this trust. Anyone obtaining the story must be trained to interview victims of sexual violence. The interviewer should make sure that the immediate environment is secure and private. They should also ensure that any medical, psychological, and safety issues have been addressed. They have to provide a trained interpreter if needed and with the consent of the victim or survivor. They have to ensure that the victims have access to and choice of same-sex interviewer. They have to acknowledge the difficulty in telling the account. Ensure that the victim is comfortable enough to speak and is not doing so under coercion. Seek the victim's informed consent to document the details that they tell you and to hold this information securely until a date later. Stress the importance of being truthful and of the value of his or her account. Allow the victim to have another person present. This is obligatory for minors if their guardian or parents are present in the room. Offer emotional and social support during the process. Allow the victim to tell his or her story when and how they wish. They have to also be sensitive to cultural, ethnic, and religious needs of the victim. And above all, listen with empathy and allow a free narrative. Some examples of a question that could be asked of the person or the victim telling their story will be their personal information. Is she a victim or a witness? The setting of the assault and the details of the assault. Next slide, please. So next we have documenting the story and responses. Documenting an individual's account of sexual violence is an important component of the medical legal processes. Such documentation captures the allegation and examination findings and create a permanent record of details of any subsequent intervention. These records are important for the medical management of the individuals and for any subsequent investigation and prosecution. Documentation may also have an important role in the therapeutic process for those who have been assaulted. It is important to identify whose role it is to document the story and to recognize that it is not the role of the health providers to make legal determination. So here are some examples of what what should be documented. We have allegations of sexual violence made by the individuals. The victim, family members, or witnesses should also be documented. Such documentation should occur at the time the allegation is made or as soon as possible afterwards. They have to ensure that the victims will understand how and why you are documenting the story and how this information will be stored and used. The documentation should be handwritten, typed or recorded, and is signed and dated by the person doing it and by the victim. Try to capture the words or languages used by the individual. Document the story in his or her word as comprehensively as possible. Clearly indicate the language used for the interview and whether an interpreter was used. Identify who provided the account, where and when it was obtained, and any other parties or witnesses present. Document all examination findings and any treatment initiated. If possible, photograph any injuries while ensuring confidentiality. Generally, photograph of the breasts and genitalia should not be undertaken. Ensure that the photographs do not allow direct identification of the individual. Use a confidential code system to allow authorized staff to identify the individual and note when the photographs were taken. Record details of any specimen obtained, including the date and time and their subsequent handling. Lastly, they have to make sure that the notes, photographs, and other records are held securely and only accessed by authorized individuals. Next, please.
We will now proceed to the elements of initial investigation. Multiple personnel and services are required to investigate an allegation of sexual assault. First is the police. Police may be the first to respond to a report. So kadalasan kasi ng mga crime na nag-o-occur is nauunang ma-report sa police station. That is why usually sila talaga yung first responder sa isang crime scene. So meron silang different roles and their roles are important in an investigation. First is in securing the safety of the victim. So sila yung nagsisecure kung safe ba yung victim, and sila din yung nag-ensure ng any immediate medical needs. So kung merong may kailangan ng halimbawa may kailangang dalhin sa ospital, madalas sila yung tumatawag na ambulansya aside from the yung mga bystanders, ayon. And then lastly, they are the ones who control the scene until the arrival of the investigators. So usually, 'di ba may nakikita tayo na parang yung line na may nakalagay na police line. Yun yung ginagamit nila to control the scene para wala masyadong pumasok na hindi naman part ng investigation dun sa crime scene. Yun yung kumbaga nagsiserve as barrier na hindi sila pwedeng pumasok kasi ito ay crime scene and baka maapektuhan yung makokollect na evidence or ayun. Next is the crime scene is a location where physical evidence should be sought and retrieved. So yung crime scene, doon nangyari yung krimen, kaya nga crime scene. And syempre, kung doon nangyari yung krimen, doon ka maraming makukuha na evidences na pwede mong makolek and pwede mong dalhin sa laboratory for examination. Scene investigators are responsible for the management of the scene and the collection and submission of specimens to the laboratory. So after makontrol ng mga pulis yung scene, after nilang ma-determine kung alin yung primary crime scene, yung scene investigators naman, sila naman yung magmamanage ng crime scene. Sila yung magko-collect ng mga evidences na makukuha nila. Sila yung magde-determine if related ba tong evidence na to dun sa crime na nangyari. And after nilang makolek with the chain of custody, isasubmit nila yung specimens doon sa laboratory for examination. Then, the laboratory has an important role in providing scientific services for the investigation of sexual offenses. If such services cannot be provided locally, there may be capacity to store at and transit specimens to another laboratory. So, syempre, napakahalaga ng role ng laboratory. Kasi, doon natin i-examine yung mga nakolek na evidence. Hindi lang naman kasi pwedeng collect lang tayo ng collect ng evidence. Kailangan din nating patunayan if doon ba sa perpetrator talaga galing yon or yung evidence ba na to ay galing sa victim or galing sa ibang tao. And makakatulong ang laboratory para ma-determine yon. And if ever na hindi naman sapat yung facilities na meron sa local laboratories, maaari yung i-store and dalhin to another laboratory na may sapat na facilities para hindi ma-compromise yung investigation. So there are key points in initial investigation. First is victims should have any medical needs addressed immediately. Their ongoing care and support should be a priority. So in an initial investigation, ang priority talaga is the victim. Aalagaan yung victim, i-identify kung anong medical needs ang kailangan, psychological needs ang kailangan, and ayun, kailangan i-prioritize siya sa initial investigation pa lamang. Second is, it is important to ensure that a prompt policing response can be provided whenever an allegation of sexual violence is received. The priorities will include the identification of a crime, ensuring the safety of all individuals involved, and preservation of the crime scene. So kailangan kapag nakakuha tayo ng report ng sexual violence, kailangan prompt yung pag-akto natin. May prompt policing response agad pagdating dun sa victim. Included dun yung kailangan ma-identify agad natin yung crime na nangyari. Kailangan i-ensure natin yung safety ng lahat ng individuals, not only the victim. Kasi if ever na yung victim, halimbawa, yung crime or mostly yung sexual violence ay nangyari sa bahay, and yung gumawa ng sexual violence is kasamahan sa bahay, it is not only the victim yung kailangan nating ensure yung safety, but also other family members para ma-avoid na yung ganun ulit na pangyayari. And lastly is the preservation of crime scene. So kailangan nating i-preserve yung crime scene para ma-collect natin ng maayos and ma-examine natin ng maayos yung evidences sa laboratory. Next is, suspects should be identified, searched, secured, and removed from the scene as soon as possible. Investigators should inform suspects of their rights and ensure their safety. So, yung suspects kailangan ma-identify agad, mahanap agad, and ma-secure and ma-remove siya sa crime scene kasi usually, syempre, maaari niyang itago yung mga pwedeng evidence na para sa kanya. na magli-link sa kanya dun sa crime scene. But also, since suspect siya, kailangan pa rin nating i-ensure na sabihan siya ng kanyang karapatan bilang isang tao, and kailangan din natin na pangalagaan yung kanyang safety. Next is effective crime scene management requires that the documentation, preservation, collection, labeling, packaging, security, chain of custody, and storage of evidence is undertaken in a professional manner that can withstand subsequent scrutiny. So, syempre, ang effective na crime scene management, kailangan may documentation ka. Kailangan i-photograph mo yung makukuha mo yung evidence. Ma-photograph mo yung crime scene. And of course, kailangan ma-preserve mo yung makokolek mong evidence. Kasi kung hindi mo ma-preserve yan and basta mo yan i-collect, hindi yan magiging credible. Hindi yan magiging credible na pwedeng gamitin para malink yung suspect dun sa crime. And of course, labeling. Kailangan i-label mo yung evidence na makukuha mo. Kasi baka kasi usually, 'di ba? Itrina-transit siya sa other laboratory. So kung hindi mo siya i-label, baka maglabo-labo 'yan, and hindi na siya magiging credible for linking the suspect. Of course, the packaging, kasi mahalaga din yan ang packaging. Kasi kung hindi maayos yung pagpapackage, halimbawa is ginamitan mo ng plastic in which hindi naman pala, kasi yung plastic meron siyang kapag nabasa or maaaring ma-damage yung collected evidence. So magkakaroon na siya ng effect dun sa kinuha mong evidence and dun sa investigation na mangyayari. Of course, the security, yung chain of custody, napakahalaga ng chain of custody, and storage of evidence is undertaken in a professional manner. Next is interviewing victims requires care, patience, and sensitivity. Interviews should be conducted by individuals who have received specific training in this field and in a location and manner that respect the choices, privacy, safety, and confidentiality of the victims. Victims should have access to and choice of a same-sex interviewer if at all possible. Special measures must be taken when interviewing child victims. So pagdating naman sa yung mga tao na pwedeng mag-interview ng victims, malalaman natin yan sa further discussion ng ating report. Matatalakay natin yan. Next is forensic laboratories require specialist staff, secure storage facilities, and reliable equipment. If such a service is not accessible, then arrangements should be made to securely store specimens and send them to appropriate service. And lastly, the need for effective communication between the services involved, health, social, laboratory, and legal, is a fundamental element of a coordinated response. So hindi porke tapos na ang mga pulis sa pagkontrol ng scene, tapos na yung role nila. Kailangan nilang makipag-coordinate ng maayos, makipag-communicate ng maayos sa health services, sa social services, of course sa laboratory, and pati na rin sa legal aspect ng ating investigation. So minimum requirements for health facility. Clinical management of rape is possible even in very low resource settings, including those affected by conflict. The clinical management of rape must take precedence over other aspects of medico-legal processes. So, matatalakay natin dito sa minimum requirements for health facility, yung basic infrastructure na kailangan, yung personals na kailangan, supplies na kailangan, and medications na kailangan. So first, yung general requirement for the health facility. A victim should have the choice to have a support person or companion with them at any or all stages of the process, lalong-lalo na sa mga minors. Kailangan na kasama nila yung parents nila. And of course, kapag naman hindi na minor, meron silang choice na magkaroon ng support person or companion sa kahit na sa lahat ng stages ng process ng investigation and ng examination. The wishes of the victim should always be respected. So kung ano yung kailangan ng victim, ibibigay natin. Kung ano yung kailangan na medical needs, ibibigay natin. Psychological needs, ibibigay natin. Next is the safety of the victim is primary importance. Kagaya nga nung sinabi ko kanina sa initial investigation, priority natin yung care. Priority natin yung support pagdating sa victim. Next is protocol. Written medical protocol in the language of the health provider. So yung protocol dapat merong written medical protocol. Next is personnel. So sino nga ba ang pwedeng maging personnel sa isang health facility? Una ay ang mga trained local healthcare professionals. So kailangan train sila na healthcare professionals na mag-handle ng reports pagdating sa sexual abuse, sexual violence. And a same language, same-sex health worker or a translator with the offer of a companion or support person in the room during examination. So, ideal talaga pagdating sa sexual violence examination na same-sex health worker yung mag-a-assist doon sa victim. Next is furniture or setting. Ang pagdating sa furniture and setting, syempre unang-una yung room. Kailangan private yung room. Hindi pwedeng magkakasama yung mga victims. Kailangan i-prioritize din natin ang privacy ng ating victim. Of course, kailangan quiet, hindi pwedeng magulo. Accessible para sa lahat. Clean, syempre kailangan malinis. And with access to a toilet or tree. Next is the examination table. Kailangan ng examination table para sa isang health facility and yung light is preferably fixed. Next is yung mga supplies natin. Access to equipment that is sterilized or disposable and unused. So pagdating sa supplies, kailangan pag halimbawa hindi disposable yung ginagamit mo, i-make sure mo na malinis yung ginagamit mong equipment or sterilize yung ginagamit mong equipment. Bakit? Bukod sa gross tingnan na na ginamit mo dun sa isang victim tapos hindi sa isang survivor tapos gagamitin mo ulit sa isang survivor na hindi mo pa naman nililinis, ay of course makakaapekto yon sa pagkuha mo ng evidence mula doon sa victim. And syempre kung di naman sterilized, pwede namang disposable or yung mga hindi pa nagagamit. Supplies for collection of forensic evidence. These items are sometimes available as prepackaged rape kits. So matagal na naman nating na-encounter yung rape kits. So ano ba ang laman ng rape kits? Nandito ang mga swabs and containers for transporting swabs, microscope slides, blood tubes, urine specimen containers, sheets of paper, paper bags, plastic specimen bags, and tweezers, scissors, and comb. So kailangan din natin ng supplies for universal precautions. Ano ba yung mga supplies for universal precautions? Nandito yung mga gloves, mask, cleaning materials, and of course, yung soap. Next is yung medical supplies for wound care. Nandito din yung gown, cloth, or sheet to cover the victim during the examination. Nandito rin yung mga sanitary supplies, kasama na yung mga pads and local cloths, and set of replacement clothes for the victims, including footwear. This should not be clothes that may identify the victim as someone who has been raped or that can link them to the clinic. So, syempre, kailangan, kung magbibigay ka ng replacement clothes, huwag naman yung halimbawa, makakapag-determine na parang, ay, rape victim siya. So, kailangan is maayos na replacement clothes, walang tatak na kahit na ano na maglilink sa kanya doon sa clinic and all. Pagdating naman sa medications, for prophylaxis or treatment of sexually transmitted infections as per country protocol, antiretroviral drugs for post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, emergency contraception, analgesics or yung madalas na example nito is paracetamol, antibiotics for wound care, and tetanus prophylaxis. So pagdating naman sa administrative supplies, makita natin medical charts with pictograms and body charts para usually yung body charts ginagamit natin para ma-determine kung saan merong physical injury or injury yung ating patient. Consent forms, napakahalaga sa isang sexual violence examination, yung consent forms. Information pamphlets for post-rape care for survivor in the language of choice, safe or secure locked filing space to keep confidential records, and information on support and other services to which the survivor can be referred. So hindi lang naman kasi natatapos na after ng examination, tapos na. Kung kailangan pa ng further support ng patient, maaari natin silang bigyan ng information kung saan natin sila pwedeng i-refer na services. Halimbawa ay sa DSWD, halimbawa ay sa psychological services, yun, or pwede silang i-refer natin sa public attorney's office. Lahat ng kailangan nilang services, maaari natin silang i-inform. Excuse me, wait lang po. Next is managing the health issues. Sexual violence may result in a range of negative outcomes for the victim, either physical yan, psychological, mental, or social. A victim's presentation to a health service provides an opportunity to identify and address a range of health issues which may be pre-existing or the result of their assaults. The first priority is ensuring a victim's access to health services that deliver a timely, comprehensive, and professional service both at the time of presentation and subsequently. So pupunta naman tayo sa key points in managing health issues. First is we must ensure victims are informed of every step of the medical process so they can consent to each part, are prepared, and can make informed decisions. So kagaya nga na sinabi ko kanina, napakahalaga ng consent sa every part or sa every step ng medical process. Next is ensure that all injuries are documented. Notes or photograph, ino-note natin dun sa body charts and or pipictura natin. And syempre, hindi lang naman natin kailangan i-document, kailangan i-treat din natin yung injuries na natamo nila. Respond to any concerns regarding the risk of pregnancy. This might include baseline testing, offering of post-coital contraception, following up reviews, and management of any resultant pregnancy in conformity with national or local policies and laws. Next is explain and address HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. This might include a risk assessment, baseline testing, recommendation of post-exposure prophylaxis, and subsequent reviews. Next is we must ensure that the victim comprehends the potential health consequences of the assault, the significance and possible side effects of any interventions and decision-making required. Next is make sure that the victim understand the key issues and her or his opinions and rights and is able to consent to any treatment decision. Refer the victim to other centers, services when more specialized interventions are required. Offer the victim access to counseling and support services. Ideally, this should occur at the time of the first recitation, at any subsequent reviews, and when requested by the family of the victim. And lastly, make certain that the victim's personal safety is dealt with. Issues of confidentiality or security information, housing, and personal protection for the victim and their family may be or may need to be addressed. So usually naman, madalas dito sa key points sa managing of health issues is natalakay na rin natin dun sa naunang part. Next is pupunta na tayo sa forensic medical examination. A clinical assessment provides an opportunity for clinical management, the documentation of findings and collection of material required to assist a criminal investigation. So ano nga ba ang mga key points sa forensic medical examination? First is only providers who have been explicitly trained and supervised should undertake full forensic examination. So, yung mga trained and supervised lang ang pwedeng mag-perform ng forensic examination. All health providers should be able to, as a minimum, provide care to the victim as well as document the victim's story, conduct a medical examination, and record any injuries. Next is only medical evidence that can be collected, stored, analyzed, and used should be gathered, and only with the full informed consent of the victim. Next is a careful explanation should be provided to the victim. This should include the reasons for and the extent of the proposed examination, any procedures that might be conducted, the collection of specimens, and photography. A sensitive and specific explanation of any genital and anal examination is required. Next is prior to commencing the examination, it is important to ensure that the facility is clean and secure. A chaperone is present and all relevant equipment is possible. Next is specific measures should be taken if the victim is a minor. Next is consent to undertake the examination should be obtained from the individual or their guardian. The consent should be specific to each procedure, to the release of the findings and specimens, and to any photograph. The victim may consent to some aspects and not others and may withdraw consent. The consent should be documented by signature or fingerprint. The hymen is a poor marker of penetrative sexual activity or virginity in post-pubertal girls. There is no place for virginity testing. It has no scientific validity and is humiliating for the individual. Digital examinations of the vagina and anus are rarely warranted. They should not be used to assess the tone or elasticity of vagina or anus or to comment on likelihood or frequency of penetration. The general appearance and functioning of the individual, kasama na yung demeanor, mental status, drug effects, cooperation, should be documented, as well as the identity of the examiner and date, time, location of the examination. nakita naman natin dun sa activity 4 natin kung ano yung usually laman ng isang report pagdating sa sexual abuse, and nakita natin na nakalagay doon na may date kung kailan ginawa ang forensic examination, may time din, and may location na nilagay doon sa forensic report. Next is any limitations to the examination, kagaya ng lighting, cooperation, should also be documented. A comprehensive examination should be performed, directed by the history provided. The sites examined, not examined, or not examined should be documented. All recent and old injuries should be recorded and described in detail, recording any pertinent negative findings. The victim should be informed that some injuries might become more possible after some days, and that if this happens, she or he should return for examination and documentation. Next, a note should be made of any specimen collected, photography undertaken, diagnostic test ordered, or treatment initiated. And lastly, the individual should be given a detailed explanation of the findings and their treatment and follow-up. Pupunta naman tayo sa medico-legal evidence in sexual violence. So ito naman ipapasadahan lamang natin since may iba namang group na magdi-discuss ng mismong medico-legal evidence with regards to sexual violence. So the objectives of evidence collection can include to support a sexually violent act and some of its circumstances, to establish a link between the aggressor and the victim, to link facts and persons to the crime scenes, and lastly, to identify the perpetrator. So, ano nga ba ang key points sa medico-legal evidence in sexual violence? The physical examination is primarily conducted to address health issues. If it is performed within 5 days of the assault, there may be value in collecting forensic specimens. All examinations should be documented. Next is penetrative sexual activity of the vagina, anus, or mouth rarely produces any objective signs of injury. The hymen may not appear injured even after penetration has occurred. Hence, the absence of injury does not include penetration. The health practitioner cannot make any comment on whether the activity was consensual or otherwise. There are different purposes and processes for the collection of specimens for health and legal investigations. So papasok dito yung pathology specimens which are analyzed to establish a diagnosis or monitor a condition. And then yung legal or forensic specimens naman are used to assess whether an offense has been committed and whether there is a linkage between individuals or locations. Pathology specimens may have significant forensic importance, especially if a sexually transmitted infection is found. Next is the forensic laboratory requires information about the specimen, including yung time, date, patient name or ID number, nature and site of collection, and what is being looked for. Next is forensic specimens. Forensic specimens, the account of the assault will dictate whether and what specimens are collected. If in doubt, if hindi nyo sure kung kailangan ba itong i-collect or hindi, i-collect nyo na para sure. Persistence of biological material is variable. It may be affected by time, activities, which is yung washing, and contamination from other sources. The maximum agreed time interval, time of assault to time of collection for routine collection is, so pwede nyo itong i-take note, sa skin including bite marks, 72 hours. Sa mouth, 12 hours. Sa vagina, up to 5 days. Sa anus, 48 hours. Foreign material on objects, kagaya ng condom or clothing, no time limit. urine, in which madedetermine natin through toxicology, kapag 50 ml up to 5 days, and blood, in which madedetermine din natin pag sa toxicology, ay up to 48 hours in tubes containing sodium fluoride and potassium oxalate. Hair. Cut scalp hair may be useful if there is concern of covert drug administration. Next is careful labeling, storage, and chain of custody recording is required in all cases. Samples should not be placed in culture media and should be dry before being packaged. Clothing, especially underwear, and toxicological samples should be collected if required. Photographs provide a useful adjunct to injury documentation. Issues of consent access need to be addressed and agreed with the victim. Sexual violence should be considered during an autopsy examination. Documentation and specimen collection should occur in such cases. And lastly, if sexual assault results in pregnancy, then consideration should be given to collection of specimen for paternity testing. So, pupunta naman tayo sa forensic specimen. Collection of specimens from individuals alleging sexual violence may provide investigators with information to support or negate allegations. Consent for collection should be obtained from all individuals. Specimens may corroborate contact between individuals or between individual and location. Evidence of contact occurs at the time of the offense but disappears quickly. Only evidence that has been collected and stored and analyzed should be used in the investigation court proceedings. Result of analysis must be interpreted carefully, objectively, and context of the investigation. It is exceedingly rare for a case proceed on the single piece of evidence, example, DNA and fingerprint. So pagdating naman sa key points in forensic specimen, consent for the collection and release of the specimen should be obtained from the victim. The impact of the collection of specimens on the victim should be carefully considered. The account provided by the victim and the time between the alleged assault and examination will dictate whether collection should occur and what type of specimens are collected. Collect specimens from locations where biological material might have been deposited, pwedeng sa skin, hair, and oral, vaginal, and anal orifices. Pay careful attention to the detail in the labeling and recording of specimens collected. Allow any wet specimens to dry. Do not use culture media for forensic specimens. Collect blood and urine samples for toxicological analysis if there are allegations of covert or non-consenting drug administration. Document transfer of specimens or yung chain of custody, what, to whom, and when transfer occurred. Alternatively, ensure specimens are stored appropriately. Take precautions against contamination and restrict access to examination facilities. Ensure facilities are cleaned between cases and change gloves frequently. So, pupunta naman tayo sa definitions and comments pagdating sa sexual abuse sa female genitalia. So, itong nakikita nyo sa picture, may mga numbers yan. So, ang number 1 natin, pwede nyo itong i-take note, ay yung tinatawag nating mons pubis. Yung mons pubis is where the labia majora meet in front and covered with hair after puberty. Next is urethral opening, yung number 2. Yung number 3 naman is yung tinatawag nating hymen. Number 4 naman is yung tinatawag nating posterior fourchae. Number 5 is perineal raphe. 6, itong 6 is yung perineum. Number 7 is fossa navicularis. Itong number 8, yung tinatawag nating labia minora. Number 9, yung tinatawag nating labia majora. Yung number 10, ito, yung inaano nating clitoris. Number 11, ay yung vulva. Number 12 is yung vagina. And 13 is anus. So comments pagdating sa female genitalia, or ano ba yung kailangan nating i-take note pagdating in examining the female genitalia. In most cases, penetration of the adult vagina or anus does not result in injury. The hymen may not appear injured even after penetration has occurred. The hymen is a poor marker of penetrative sexual activity or virginity in post-pubertal girls. Digital examinations of the vagina and anus are rarely warranted. They should not be used to assess the tone of the orifice or to comment on the likelihood or frequency of penetration. And penetration of the prepubertal genitalia do not necessarily result in physical injury. So next naman is yung male genitalia. So yung number 1 is yung penis. Number 2 is yung glans or yung head. Number 3 is yung shaft. Number 4 is yung testicle. Number 5 is yung scrotum. And number 6 is yung anus. So comments naman pagdating sa male genitalia. The uncircumcised male has a retractable piece of skin that may cover the glans or yung tinatawag nating foreskin. In most cases, penetration of the anus does not result in injury or other changes. Digital examination of the anus is rarely indicated. This procedure should not be used to assess the tone of the orifice or to comment on the likelihood of frequency of penetration. Sexual activity, touching, sucking, masturbation, and intercourse rarely causes any objective changes to the male genitalia. The passage of hard stools, some medical conditions kagaya ng Crohn's disease, and sometimes chronic diarrhea may cause anal fissures and other changes. Next po.
So we collected data about the present status of investigating sexual abuse. First is according to the 2017 National Demographic and Health Survey, 1 in 20 women and girls aged 15 to 49 have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. Next is as observed, the percentage of women who have experienced violence in physical, sexual, and or emotional form from their husband declines slightly with women's age. Women who are divorced, separated, or widowed are more likely to have experienced all forms of violence by their most recent partner compared with women who are married or living together. It is collected that 53% of divorced, separated, or widowed women have experienced physical, sexual, or emotional violence compared with 24% of women who are married or living together. Next is based on the preliminary findings of the 2017 National Demographic and Health Survey, 1 in 4 or 26% ever married women age 15 to 49 has ever experienced physical, sexual, or emotional violence by their husbands or partner. 1 in 5 women has ever experienced emotional violence. 14% has experienced physical violence, and 5% has ever experienced sexual violence by their current or most recent husband or partner. Since spousal or intimate partner violence is the most common form of violence for women aged 15 to 49, the 2017 National Demographic and Health currently married women were asked about violence perpetrated by their current husband or partner, and formerly married women were asked about violence perpetrated by their most recent husband or partner. Next po. For our case, it is the case of Rosario Baluyot. So Rosario Baluyot ran away from her grandmother's house and became a street children at Olongapo, then known as Sin City due to its widespread prostitution, most catering to tourists and Americans stationed in what was then the U.S. Naval Base in Subic. Circumstances forced her yield and enter this unfortunate profession. At midnight on October 10, 1986, a man who violated her, Heinrich Ritter, brought Rosario and her friend Jessie, a young boy, to a hotel at MGM Hotel along Magsaysay Drive, Olongapo City, where he allegedly abused them, and Ritter masturbated Jessie and fingered Rosario. Afterwards, he inserted a foreign object into the vagina of Rosario. The next morning, Rosario told Jessie that Ritter inserted an object inside her vagina. Then Ritter paid the children for only 200 and to 300 pesos each. He then left them in the hotel, and after the American left, they went downstairs and Rosario told that the American inserted something in her vagina. But they could not do anything anymore because the American had already left, and neither did they report the matter to the police. On May 14, 1987, Rosario was confined at Olongapo City General Hospital for alienment, which came out later as symptoms of peritonitis due to a massive infection in the abdominal cavity. Subsequently, on May 17, 1987, it was found out that there was a foreign object lodged in her vaginal canal, and she has a vaginal discharge tinged with blood and foul-smelling odor emanating from her body. Her abdomen was enlarged, tender, and distended, symptoms of peritonitis. It was in the evening of May 19 when Dr. Rosette opened her abdomen and found out that the portion of a sexual vibrator said the object was coated with tissue, pus, and blood. The following day, Rosario got serious and was pronounced dead in the afternoon of May 20, 1987. Ritter was jailed in September 1987 but was released after an out-of-court settlement of 15,000 with Rosario's grandmother. In the same year, Ritter was rearrested when the judge nullified the settlement. In 1989, the regional trial court charged Ritter with rape and homicide. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and was ordered to pay Rosario's grandmother 60,000 pesos. In 1991, however, the Supreme Court reversed the RTC's decision. It acquitted and deported Ritter back to Austria. He was ordered to pay 30,000. One of the factors that led the court to acquit the man originally charged and convicted of rape with homicide in the country where the age of consent for sex is 12 is because of the lack of birth certificate or any proof of the age of Rosario Baluyot. Yun lang po. Thank you po.
So that is all lang po regarding po sa investigation of sexual abuse. Thank you po.
Okay na? Hello?
Yes po.
So,